Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, as Senator Ingebrigtsen said earlier this morning, it is a wonderful day. So first thing, are there any specific things from Olivia to start out the week?
No, we are in the process of de-identifying the juvenile data that Sheriff Heck requested. That's currently going through review just to confirm that we are protecting identities as best we can. And then we are currently also processing some additional data to just see what we can pull. Yeah, that's all that's cooking on our end. And if anything else comes up in terms of data requests, we'll process those as they arrive. So.
Okay. From our chairs, anything you wanted to start with, Sheriff Heck? Okay, Stacy.
I don't have anything.
Okay. So our requirements subgroup today, this is focusing on the requirements placed on registrants, including extension of registration periods and collateral consequences related specifically to the registration requirement. There are perhaps other areas, as has been discussed at each of the subgroup meetings, there tends to be some bleeding of these issues into each of the subgroups, but we're trying to keep them focused in the appropriate one. Was there any issue that we wanted to start with this morning?
The survey results?
That they should be available. I thought they were, oh, let me see. They actually just arrived. So I will take a look at that and pull it in. It'll just take me a minute. It looks like there's about 8 attachments here.
Oh, okay.
Just give me a minute or so, and I'll share them.
Sure. So I think just to get the discussion going, one of the issues on the table is this, depending on what we see with the survey, one of the issues is, do we look at a certain class of crimes that trigger the registration requirement for 10 years again? And do we look at that? Do we look at a certain class of crimes and determine that we don't want all of what's currently the retrigger, that we want to narrow that? The reason would be that there's a feeling of the net is being cast too wide. On the other hand, we know that just just to play, to understand both sides, we heard research presented last week at our larger group that recidivism rates are very, very low. The longer someone lives in the community offense-free. I don't know what the recidivism rates, how they are impacted if there isn't another offense. We didn't really talk about that. We just talked about if there's no additional offenses. But I think the issue from my standpoint is, are we, imposing another 10 years on crimes that have nothing to do with really a predatory, offense or predatory behavior? And if so, can we as a group come to a consensus that the list should be examined at least and considered for whittling down? That's how I see it. That's what I see the issue is.
I do have the results here on the requirements survey, which was essentially one question. There were 14 responses, and the first one was leave reincarceration extensions as currently in statute. 3 of 14 said yes. And then the next question was extend registration only for reincarcerations related to a predatory offender registration offense or crime against the person. Yeses were 11. And then the third question was do not extend registration for reincarcerations. There were 0 yeses on that. So it was the first 2 limit. It had 11 in support, and don't change it at all had 3 in support.
And Mark, you'll be posting the results, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And Sheriff Heck.
I'm recalling correctly that at that presentation that Stacy mentioned, I think there was a slide that said an indicator of increased risk for recidivism was any criminal activity in that 10-year period.
Do we know what the increase is? Did it say?
I don't recall quantifying that, but I thought I recalled seeing information that a conviction or any criminal behavior was an indication of an increased risk for recidivism.
And I think Brian can answer that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to jump in on, that exact subject. So the one slide I presented was at least regarding static 99R scores and years offense-free in the community. So let's say somebody went 10 years completely offense-free. They started with a 6 on the static. They would be in the well above average risk category, the highest risk category. After 10 years, they fall into the average risk range. So they drop kind of 2 risk levels. However, if there's any criminal activity outside of non-sex offending criminal activity in there, outside of petty misdemeanors, I think they're looking at a misdemeanor level. I think they're called criminal code offenses in Canada, which is essentially misdemeanors and up. They were sort of reduced, you pull back about 3.3 years from that 10 years. So they'd be in that 6 point, whatever range there. And the risk would be lessened, but not as much as if they went completely crime-free. So there is some empirical ways, at least according to this research and what I presented on tabulating that. I didn't present the associated recidivism risk numbers, but we can pull that out of the research information. And I can send, I don't think I sent the PowerPoint or the main study that I pulled from. I can send that to Mark and Olivia after the meeting, and we can get those numbers too.
Brian, you can just send it to the group.
Send it to the group. All right.
Yeah.
Do.
And then, Mark, these are all going to be posted, right? The slideshows used?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
We'll get them from and Professor Janice too. Sherry.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same. I thought I recalled it the same way that Brian was stating it. But the other thing is, it was interesting. I spent some time looking at the registrants in Hennepin County and really going through what you could see online and reading and understanding exactly what had been committed. And I think it's interesting when you start thinking, I think Janice made a comment about crimes of violence or crimes of that were not related necessarily. Was there a relationship between control and recidivism and acts of aggression? And he made some comment towards the end that I was looking back at my notes on that led me to sort of look at the registrants that I saw, even in Hennepin County, because it's so large. And the number of crimes per se that included coercion with a firearm, threatening behavior that wasn't from someone they knew. So it made me start to think, Stacy, your question around like exactly what they did, which is perhaps where I'm wanting to look at a little bit of a deeper dive, because I do think that there was a good deal of conversation around acts of violence or acts of aggression that weren't necessarily being accounted for, and led me to say, hey, I'm not sure how I feel about this 10-year extension when so many of those crimes have something in them that was not someone I know or in a situation that probably wouldn't have had you incarcerated for another reason as well. And I understand that kind of bleeds into the crimes group as well, but it made me take pause as to whether or not that does allow increased recidivism. If you look at Hennepin County specifically, go into all 50, 60 registrants that are there at level 3, it is a mixed bag of people that are not known.
Stacy.
Brian, do we know what the risk level is for someone to commit a sex offense who has no criminal history? So like me, what's my risk of, do we have like a baseline? And maybe I'm not a good example, but
Here's a
just the
zero,
average
Stacy, but,
person,
yeah, that's
the
not-
average law-abiding
that's a good
person, what is the risk level? Do we know?
Well, so really what the research that I presented talks about is not necessarily anybody with no criminal history, but people with a criminal history that doesn't include sex offense or sex-related offense convictions is about 1% to 2%. So they're saying now the desistance rate really that we're, at least they're saying we could be comfortable with, and some, it's not zero, nothing's ever going to be zero, kind of, taking that into consideration. But guys that are falling, according to this chart, after time, offense-free, and then even calculating in additional non-sex offenses, getting below that sort of lowest level 1% to 2% threshold. Some guys start in that area. Some guys it takes 3 years to get there. They're at the second lowest risk level. The bulk of the folks are going to be in kind of the average risk range. About half of the folks in that average risk of reoffense. It's going to take 6 to 8 years to fall below that desistance threshold for a lot of those guys. The real high risk guys are the upper 20%, or not even probably in the top two categories that are going to take a little more time. So I'd say 1% to 2% is a good ballpark for somebody with a criminal history to commit a sex offense if they've never done so before.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Yes. Yep.
Have we, in it, so when we look at the work that we're doing here, have we put to bed or at least satisfied the notion that the paperwork requirement itself is reasonable, the 8 pages and the things that we looked at? Because I had 2 or 3 different open items from last session, and I know we received all the paperwork and were able to look at the questions, process. Is that still a part of today's discussion as well?
I believe that's part of the methods discussion, but
Okay.
others could clarify that. I don't know if we've arrived at a final issue on that.
Sherry, when you say the paperwork, do you mean the,
Compliance component on the monthly basis, and then initially any of the updates that folks put through monthly. There was that whole discussion around whether going non-compliant based on the paperwork component was seen as far too punitive or difficult. And so I think that was I wasn't sure if that led to extension slash, was a requirement component, or whether it was method. That's what I was trying to validate, because it kind of mixed two groups and I wasn't sure where it was falling.
but are you questioning whether, so you're questioning maybe the frequency with which needs to be updated, or are you also questioning the actual information that's required?
I think we were questioning both things in one of the last sessions, and I don't know that we put a bow on that one, as to say the paperwork is reasonable, the paperwork isn't reasonable, the requirements in terms of frequency and the difficulty. I know we had the speaker on who had said, here's some of the challenges associated with it. And we talked about some individuals that may have a learning disability or bilingualism, making it more challenging to complete the paperwork. But if you went non-compliant, there was an extension question there as well. So I kind of wasn't sure if it fell under requirements or methods or both, but I know that we all spent time looking through the paperwork itself, and I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss that portion in this particular session. But again, I confuse methods and requirements quite a bit sometimes.
This is Katie. Can I just ask a question? If you're looking at the number of times in a year, again, we only send them once a year to the verification letters, once a year to the majority of the offenders. The only ones that get twice a year are those who are civilly committed as sexually dangerous or sexually psychopathic personality, as well as level 3 offenders out in the community who are no longer on supervision for their registration offense. So,
and level 3 no longer on supervision is still annually?
No, the level 3 under supervision for their registration offense is once a year. Once they are off supervision for their registration offense as a level 3, they get them twice a year.
Okay, unless of course, but if they change physical, they cut and dye their hair, they lose 30 pounds, whatever they do, if they change dramatically, or things like driving a different vehicle or any of those things that are changed, it's on them to bring that to either their supervisor or the sheriff's office. Is that correct, as I was reading?
That is correct, but those are two different processes. So in the statute, there's a process that calls out that verification by statute, the number. We follow the statute based on the number of times that requires us to send the letters. Those other changes, Sherry, that you're talking about under, I think it's 4B,
Right.
Any of those changes are to be done in person with an agent or an authority, yes.
four B is healthcare. I think it's 4A.
Thank you.
Nicole.
I have a question. I can't remember the exact wording in the survey, but when we talk about extension for registerable offenses, are we talking about what they're charged with or what they're convicted of? Because I think about so many pleas that drop certain charges. So then, I don't know, I just see it as a negotiation tool. So what are we talking about? What they're charged with or what they're convicted of?
I think in the survey, it didn't get into those subtleties. What the survey question looked at, from my understanding, is if you are convicted of not just the original registration offense, but of any registration type offense or any crime against the person offense. But that did not include charges only. Stacy.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, so I think the restart for the 10 years is you have to be convicted of a new offense and incarcerated. Right? So that's the 10-year, that's for any offense. And then if there's a failure to comply, then 5 years are added on. Does that make sense, Nicole?
Sorry, I was stuck on mute. Yes, that makes sense. I guess my question is, oftentimes people get charged with an offense, but obviously they don't get convicted. They, don't always get convicted of that offense. They may plead down to something lesser. And so this, it seems that this would be kind of a negotiation strategy if it's only what they're convicted of and not what they're charged with. Does that? So anyways, I just had a question. I just thought, don't want to have unintended consequences. And I just want to make sure that I fully understand. And also we have our annual meeting with our victim advocates from across the state on this week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I will be talking with all of them. Ashley Sturs and I will be speaking with our members about this issue as well, just to make sure we have their feedback. So thank you.
Sheriff Heck?
I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody by saying this, but I will just put this out there. If this registry if its purpose is to be, again, a pool of people that have a higher likelihood of being someone that would have committed criminal sexual conduct, and we have research that says, you know what, if you commit any crime in this period where you're expected to remain crime-free, that sets you back on that path of getting to the point where you have a much lower odds of recidivism. I'm not sure if we're following the point here, the registry, by saying, well, we're going to disregard that research and say that it's only going to be these offenses that we deem as crimes of the person or what have you, that is going to reset the 10-year period.
And Sheriff Heck, I do see it the same way. And I think the beauty of having this is that we can all agree to see things differently. And that's why we're together, because we can spur on thinking and be balanced in our thoughts. I do see it the same way. And I think after Janice last week, I felt as if there were other crimes that were indicators that your control, your expectations around compliance may have been breached to a degree. I also think that, there are some questions and challenges, I think, around what we learned maybe 2 sessions ago, which make it harder. And I think Stacey, it was the young man that you brought on who was 15 to, right, he had been on for 22 years. That really impacted me because I think as an employer, the 2 things that he said derailed him. And I don't believe that committing a crime is one of those things that, is a byproduct of being derailed in these 2 areas, which is why I feel the same way that Sheriff Heck does. 1 is employment and 2 is housing, right? Those 2 things. And am I willing as an employer to challenge my own hiring practices to say, okay, this person needs to work. Is the risk present in the job that I have enough for me to unilaterally ding a felon? No. And I'm thinking differently. And I don't think that we've maybe talked enough about what different states do to provide employment. Because if employment and housing are the 2 things that he said were, and I think we've heard this throughout both sessions, or all the sessions, that derail their state of mind, it's I'm not employed and I can't find a place to live. So the employment piece is, why wouldn't we be looking at the push that employers have not to unilaterally suggest it in a warehouse where no children are present and nothing would lead you to believe that this would happen, that we should automatically ding people from employment. That I think is almost more important. And I would agree with Sheriff Peck, if there's something that is on there that gets done, then I think that is a reset. But again, that's why we're on this task force. I felt as if I'm not sure where that employment piece falls. but it seems to be a critical component in terms of rehabilitation and the lack of recidivism is that you're adding value in the community that you live in a way so that you can truly rehabilitate. And then I had a question maybe for Angie or maybe, I'm not sure who it's for. Does maintaining compliance relative to your registration as a level 3, is completing your prescribed therapy part of compliance? Expectations around, and I tried to read it over and I don't know that I know that answer. Do you need to engage in the productive elements of therapy in order to maintain your compliance?
Brian,
So just one thing that I wanted to mention is that separate and aside from the registry, someone's criminal history is going to show the crime for which they have been convicted. So I think we're having different conversations between the registry and someone's actual criminal history.
You're completely right, Angela. And that's the point that I made to you privately. When we run a background, which is a chain of custody released by the future employee for us to check, we do see these things. And whether they're felonies registered or not, you can see unlawful imprisonment, you can see, you know, abuse by strangulation, you can see these things, and I get them every week. And the question becomes, do I automatically remove them from the hiring pool, or do I make a decision based on what I know the job looks like against what they did? And so this group has caused me to think in Minneapolis with a lot of my HR constituents differently about this. If we're going to employ folks, then should we be thinking differently about that? So I'm with you, Angela, and that's where I think Representative O'Neill got, you know, her frustration was real for me as well. You can't see anything but a level 3. That's true, but you can understand what some of the convictions have been based on the criminal history. And they release that to you when you do a background check. So I agree.
Brian,
I think I can answer Sherry's question related to the need for treatment or the requirement for treatment anyways. That's going to be a supervision requirement for most, you know, most folks in general that have sex offense convictions, recent ones, especially probably a level 3 guy, but it's not going to be tied to the compliance and related to registration itself. So if somebody's off supervision and completed their, you know, supervision requirements and still required to register beyond that, compliance with registration is not going to be tied to any kind of future additional treatment. And BCA folks can clear that up if I'm stating that incorrectly. But, and then I just want to jump in, Sheriff Hack, I agree with what you said regarding, you know, you do have I guess we don't know numbers, and that's part of the problem too, but a subset of folks that continue to commit non-sexual crimes. I showed you the research. There is some way to calculate for that their risk is not lowered as rapidly as somebody who doesn't commit, you know, any crimes. However, there's also likely a subset of folks that are 10, 15, 20 years crime-free in general, still on the registry. I think part of what the research I showed was after 20 years, there was, I think, about 400 folks still in the study. One person reoffended after that 20-year mark. There's really just, so keeping somebody on even beyond 20 years at this point from the research that we have shows that I don't think there's any effectiveness. I mean, if somebody commits a future crime and law enforcement is using the registry as a tool to, you know, identify suspects, if somebody's been on for 20 plus years, it's really, really unlikely that that guy, one of those 20 plus year folks, is going to be the person you're looking for in regards to a suspect of a more recent offense. Guys just don't, especially the guys that commit the real predatory type crimes, tend to do so within a quicker period of time, you know, post-release in general. Again, anecdotally, but.
My only point would be that in order for you to have 20 years, you would have had to reoffend. And in order for, and how many folks overall, I mean, what study to which are you referring to? Does it only include DOC inmates?
No, this was the one that the Canadian study I showed, and I can send that to you that I showed last, or kind of referred to me the last time. But I think we're getting, that's not exactly true either, Olivia, in terms of they would have had to reoffend, because we have And again, I don't know the numbers, but we see guys come in, we do the intake for anybody that comes into the DOC, anybody with any history of sex offense. A lot of guys come in on their first sex offense, and it's a CSC 2 subdivision 1A. And because they were convicted of that statute, they get lifetime registration. They didn't commit an offense as a juvenile and reoffend. They don't have a second offense as an adult. It's their first offense as an adult. Because of the subdivision, they get lifetime registration. So let's say that guy goes out and 20 years later is still on the registry because he was subject to lifetime registration right from the get-go. That's the kind of group I'm talking about, those types of individuals there. So I just want to clarify that.
Brian, are we
I
talking
don't know the
then?
numbers, but
like-
the lifetime registrant thing can be one offense based on the statute that they're convicted of. And Katie can then clarify that too a little bit more if I'm misspeaking on that too.
Correct. The average individual, though, will only have the 10 years.
Well, I guess that would be a data situation too. And I don't know if we can, that's another thing we've requested, or we could pull those numbers. Who, what are the lifetime registrants?
I'm sorry, I should correct myself. The baseline for the statute is 10 years. Beyond that, I can't speak to exactly how many people would have what.
Right, okay.
Stacy.
This is a question for Brian, that the risk level, when we say their risk level is, their recidivism rate is 6% or 1 to 2%. What does that actually mean? Does it mean that 1 to 2, for the 1 to 2%, does that mean out of 100 times or people they have a 1 to 2? Is it that they're likely to offend, or is it measured against others? What does that risk level actually mean, I guess, is what I'm trying to understand. Is that question clear?
Well, I guess I'm not interpreting it exactly correctly, but let me think about it a little bit, just in kind of how I can maybe phrase that a little bit better, but I'll revisit that.
Okay.
Because what we're asking, I think, is if it's a 6%, does that mean 6 people do it out of 100, or there's 6 times more? They're 94% of the time they won't, or like, so it's hard to.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying. Thank you, Sherry. That's what I'm trying to drill down on, is what does that number mean actually? What is stated? If we could state it another way, how else could we?
Yeah, another way to look at it is percentile rank. They often show, here's your likelihood of recidivism based on a percentage, 1 to 2% recidivism over 5 years. You're in a group of folks that has a 1 to 2% likelihood of recidivism over 2 years. But the other way to look at it is percentile rank. So according to again, based on static 99 information, somebody who scores the very lowest score you can possibly get is a -3 on that instrument. They're in the 1.3 percentile. Yeah. So 98.7% of folks are going to score higher than them, are going to be at greater risk than the folks that score a 3. So, percentile ranking in this area, you want it to be really low, right? So, some of the other numbers, if you score a 1 on that, you're at the 31st percentile. So about 70% of folks are going to score higher than that. If you're at 7, 97th percentile, only 3% score higher than a 7. That's not where you want to be. So, right? Now in school, you want to be in the 97th percentile. Here we're talking about the flip side there. So, and again, these are just it's group data. We can't make individual predictions. It's kind of like the car insurance thing. There's going to be some false positives, some false negatives. You got a teen male who already got into a car accident, is getting poor grades in school. He has way more risk factors for future accident, moving violation, as opposed to a middle-aged married female with no history of accident or anything. She's in a much lower risk group. So it's based on some of the group data in general.
So I have a question, Brian. And maybe I'm a little bit confused. How does the static 99 relate to somebody's level?
Well, and so that, yeah, maybe another thing to not get confused is we're not talking about community notification risk levels in any way. We don't use the static 99 to.
No, I know, and I'm trying to understand the divide there.
So this is kind of this, about 5 years ago, it was the, I forget, the US Centers for, it was kind of a governmental group that came up with these kind of standardized risk levels based on how an individual looks. I think I presented the one chart. I don't think I have a separate copy to show people, but folks that score that are in the well below average risk range are, what's that type of person in general look like? Somebody whose risk of reoffense from a sexual standpoint is no greater than somebody who has a non-sexual criminal history. They really don't need any treatment probably at all, and their recidivism numbers are going to remain low. Its supervision is going to be minimal. You get up to the next level, and then that average risk group is going to be guys that need some treatment and some supervision. There's, they have some criminogenic needs and things that we want to do to help them manage them and reduce their risk over time. And then some of the higher risk guys, again, a lot of supervision needs. Those are the folks that, one of the big things to remember is this risk needs responsivity model. We want to give our best stuff, with limited resources, take that into consideration. We got money and resources and staff time devoted to folks. And if we can focus on the folks that need it to reduce their risk and sort of let the others go for the most part, not focus as heavily on them, that's going to be the best use of everybody's time and resources. So that's kind of the umbrella risk needs responsivity response there in terms of how we want to manage these folks.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. You can hear me? Yeah. All right. So there's a tremendous amount of statistics going on here. This is great information. Stuff that I've not have been privy to, or at least I can't remember in the near past. But I'm just wondering, does everybody agree or disagree that having the registry, is it used as and can it be used as or is it used as a deterrent? How does that factor in with any of the studies at all? So if you're on for 10 years and you get off, does that, does that say, okay, now I can go out and reoffend again? Or because I'm at year 8, I got to be really careful. I'm not going to do this, or it does not play any part at all. Just give me a little sense of that as far as deterrent.
Stacy.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe someone has a answer for the senator. I don't. I have a.
I don't know that we have any stats on deterrence of any kind or how an individual views it. My only thought would be that it would potentially depend on the individual as to whether it was a deterrent. However, we do see repeat offenders on it. So I don't know that there's an answer to that. I'm sorry, Senator.
Right. I think, Olivia, than what Brian said last time was that at 10 years, Brian, correct? You tend to see a dramatic reduction. So whether it's behavior modification, the impact of rehabilitation and control, therapy, all of the above, we tend to see once they get to the 10, a dramatically different story around recidivism. So whether it's a deterrent and or it worked and my compliance actually made me well.
So what I would say 10 years is for some folks, for sure, it can take that long to sort of get to reduce risk if you're already in a higher risk category. But folks that are lower risk already are going to reduce their risk way before 10 years, at 3 years, 6 years, So this is, again, we're looking at individual risk or, the group group risk factors is helpful, because for some, it takes a lot longer, some doesn't, depending on their initial risk. It's kind of what I talked about. This more gets into that off ramp, I think, in the methods group a little bit more, but the need for a reassessment process, however that looks at some point, because guys don't stay the same over time. And so we can revisit that before 10 years for some folks, or whatever the process is to be determined, but I think it's a good idea in general. I was gonna just to Senator Ingebrigtsen, just briefly, in terms of the deterrent piece, we don't necessarily have data, I guess, that I'm aware of right now on that. I could look into it a little bit more, but we know that failing to register is not increasing anybody's likelihood of sexual recidivism or general recidivism. The only thing really, at least from the study that our department did, and some others in Florida and some other places, show that people with prior histories of failure to register are really only at increased risk of another failure to register. It's not usually related to they're trying to evade arrest so that they can commit all these other sex offenses. Most of the time, the failure to register data shows that it's somebody that's usually undereducated. They just have lifestyle instability in general, and bouncing from house to house and maintaining registration is not really at the top of their list necessarily.
Brian, where do you pull that data from? Where are we coming up with this?
So this is the effects of failure to register on sex offender recidivism study that Grant did March of 2010. I think I sent it to the initial group like early on, Olivia and Mark. And it just talks.
Who did they look at then, Brian? Just people that were in DOC custody? Is this a Minnesota look, or where is this taken from, and how many people?
Yeah, so there was, let me look at there's an executive summary. They had 1,561 predatory offenders released from between 2000 and 2004. 170 had a failure to register conviction. Of the 170 failure to register offenders, 126 were incarcerated for an FTR offense, where the other 44 had an FTR conviction before coming to prison. Let's see, then they just have main findings. I don't know if I want to necessarily read all of this or if we have that time, but I can produce this study again, or we could pull that. It's page 1 to 3, kind of the executive summary of that information.
And you have that on the web, if Mark has it posted on the website or not yet?
Probably not
Okay.
yet at this point.
Could we add that, Mark, so that, I mean, at least if there's a frame of reference?
Yes.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Stacy, back to you.
So two things. If the just kind of deterrence, theory, I guess, is does sending someone to prison serve as a deterrent, or does the possibility of incarceration, like let's just say the failure to register piece, is that serving a deterrent effect, or is it just making them incapable? Is it making them incapable of doing it and punishing them for having failed, or incapable of committing another crime, I guess, and then punishing them for failure to register? If the registry is serving a deterrent effect, that would suggest that it has a more criminal, it's serving a more like a criminal statute would. Because criminal statutes, I think, the idea is that the perception that you could get caught for committing a crime is a deterrent. I think deterrence theory is that going to prison and increasing the severity of punishment doesn't actually deter a crime. But it just gets into this, if it is serving as a deterrent, to failing to register, let's say, or deterring them from committing another crime, because then they would have to register for another 10 years. It just raises an interesting question about, is the registry administrative, or is it in effect more of a criminal? Is it more of a penal statute? I'd be interested to hear from people on that. And then the second thing I have is, the second thought I had was, maybe the way to look at both the failure to register and the re-trigger of 10 years for any other conviction resulting in incarceration is to, right now, there's no judicial discretion. As far as I understand, I mean, there's judicial discretion in the amount of time that one could be sentenced for a failure to register, but there's no judicial discretion in the criminal penalty, or I'm sorry, the registration re-trigger for 10 years. There's no judicial discretion. And I wonder if creating some judicial discretion, like, okay, this guy was convicted of this and he's going to be incarcerated for this, but it wasn't a violent offense, and it wasn't a whatever, a crime against a person, whatever we decide is the crimes, and that the judge would then have the discretion to say, okay, you're going to actually need to register for 5 more years based on this. Like, the re-trigger is going to be a 5-year instead of a mandatory 10-year registration re-trigger. And then for the failure to register, it looks like there's discretion in the, like I said, discretion in the sentence for failing to register, because that's a crime. But there's not discretion in the 5-year additional registration requirement if there's a failure to register. So my point, do we work in some judicial discretion, because there is none right now on the re-trigger?
Katrina.
Thanks, Mark. I was just going to speak directly to Senator Ingebrigtsen's question specific to juveniles. So there is a 2016 Caldwell study, and they say in the study, the research on the deterrent value of sex offender registration applied to juveniles has consistently shown no general or specific deterrent effect. I think Caldwell's study is the study that we sent out before. If it's not, I can happily send it out to the group.
Then Nate. Oops. We're trying to.
Oh, there we go.
Are you-
Thanks, Brian. So I apologize. I'm jumping in and out of this meeting because I have interviews for a vacancy that we're desperate to fill. But I'm not even sure what the topic is being discussed right now. But I did want to jump on a comment that Brian made having to do with I was very interested to hear that failure to register is not predictive of recidivism other than for another failure to register. And one thing that I was, I guess, surprised that wasn't on the survey that was sent out from this committee is any question regarding the mandatory minimum penalty that exists now for violation of the failure to register statute. And I'm particularly interested in this because we see a very high departure rate on this mandatory minimum penalty. Just to put it in context, the state of Minnesota it's not a jurisdiction that typically has a lot of statutory mandatory minimum penalties. The legislature's been pretty reserved on those. And in looking through the list of mandatory minimum penalties, the only other offense against a person that I see on the list is DWI, where if you get enough DWIs, eventually you're looking at a mandatory minimum penalty. And it's obvious that has some risk of danger to people. Now, you could argue that failure to register also has a risk of danger to people as well. But in light of the research that Brian's just articulated, I wonder if that shouldn't be more in a case-by-case analysis rather than saying that every violation of a failure to register is not only a felony, but even if it was an inadvertent violation, even if there's no indication that this particular offender has any particular risk, the person's learned his lesson, the person didn't even understand what the violation was, but it still violated. The legislature decrees that the only appropriate penalty for this is at least a year and a day in prison and at least 24 months in prison if it's a repeat failure to register offense. So I guess my question is, if this is something that the group is concerned about, I would urge the group to advance this as a question at least. Is this something that should continue? It's a pretty serious thing to have a statutory mandatory minimum. It's not a common thing. It's not a normal thing, and I don't know what the basis for it is, particularly in light of the research.
Sherry.
I see, Nate, and I think maybe Brian gave this data to us last time. I can't remember when we saw it, but I thought there was a dramatic jump in compliance when both the statutory and the registration minimums were applied, that went from like 30% to 95. I thought we heard something dramatic about it. And I think that's what got us to the conversation around how difficult is the paperwork to fill out? Why are people not registering? And I think if I'm sitting in the sheriff's office thinking through it, I would suggest public safety and notification is what it's there for. And so if you're not doing it, how difficult and why? And when those things went into place, Brian, am I wrong? Didn't we see, wasn't there something that we learned maybe 2 sessions ago that it took compliance up to almost 95%?
I don't know if I'm actually understanding the question, Sherry, but compliance data, I think Olivia and the BCA group provided that as far as those pieces of it. But I'm just referring specifically to, folks with failure to register convictions. And the research we have showing that doesn't increase likelihood of sexual or general recidivism. It just increases likelihood of another failure to register conviction. The data that we have anyways.
Sheriff Eck.
I'll again mention that based on my experience in our agency here, the goal of folks that are out of compliance that we find is not to get them jammed up on every small violation that we can find. And that I think I'm comfortable saying the vast majority of Minnesota law enforcement agencies are going to share that thought along with the prosecutors. I think that the fact that we have a 90% compliance rate argues towards the fact that the system is not overly burdensome and impossible to understand when you consider that, again, you've got probation officers and law enforcement that are working to try to keep people in compliance. And when we're talking about the folks that actually do get charged and face this mandatory minimum, again, this is the very small end of the funnel. And in my experience in our agency, these are the people that are actively thwarting the registration requirement, even though we've done our best to try to get them in compliance.
Representative O'Neill.
Thanks. So in 2000, I was listening to a hearing. Rich Stanek was the chair, and a Minneapolis police officer came and was speaking on behalf of Minneapolis PD. And he said at that time that only 35% of registrants were in compliance with the requirements. And so they were talking about raising it from a gross misdemeanor to a felony, which they did. And I believe the BCA then said we're up to about 85% compliance specifically for Minneapolis. And so that's what that was about. But I actually have a different question. So as we are now testing the untested rape kits, we had over 3,000, somewhere around 3,400 untested rape kits. The BCA has been working their way through them. And I'm wondering what kind of information are we getting from these untested rape kits? I'm hearing things from a prosecutor in Hennepin County where they had 1,700 untested rape kits. But as they're starting to test them, they're finding serial rapists that have been raping for decades and been in the shadows. So we all know that the likelihood a victim will report a rape is low to begin with. And then the likelihood that charges will be filed is even lower. And as you go, it just drops off tremendously. And so I question the recidivism, true recidivism, because I'm wondering how much is unreported, how many of these are in the shadows still, in the sense that those victims are unknown. Not that that perpetrator he's known, obviously, if he's been convicted with some other crime, but I'm just wondering if we even have enough data until we get through some of these untested rape kits to know a better picture of recidivism for these offenders. And I'm asking the BCA if they've have any additional information in regards to, as they're testing through these 3,400 untested kits. And well, actually on top of that, you've got 1,700 just from Hennepin alone. So that's my question, and something that we should probably consider since we're just the beginning stages of testing those.
I don't have data with me, but I can definitely ask on the status of the rape kits and if there are any consistent patterns that are being found. What I do want to note is that we don't have, for example, somebody who is sitting there looking at the results of all of the kits and gathering the patterns in them. The scientists' jobs are purely to process the kits and get that information out. So at this time, if there is a pattern that somebody happens to notice, great, but the majority of the time they're being cranked out as DNA results to the individual investigators and to law enforcement to then run with that. So I can ask if we're finding anything. I'm just not sure how much we'll have available with regards to that.
Right. I know that when you are running it and you're putting in a CODIS, it will give you a hit saying, yes, we've got these other cases, open, closed, whatever, that are related to that DNA, whether it be a burglary case like we have found or another rape kit. So I just feel like there's so much unknown. There's so many victims that haven't reported. So many kits have gone untested. I just feel like there's just a big, huge unknown. And how do we know whether or not that person has committed another sex crime or not? That's my question. How do we even know? If we think the recidivism rate is relatively low, I heard something about 92% don't reoffend. Well, how do we know that if victims aren't even coming forward, or if we're not testing the kits, or on and on and on?
Jim.
My reason why I had my hand up was to speak to Nate's comment about mandatory minimums and the need for having them. I think there's two things that play into effect, and Nate may know this, but one is that mandatory minimums often get waived because there is certainly something compelling about the case in the failure to register that garners some type of sympathy on the part of the prosecutor that allows that the mandatory minimum be waived in the first place. There is a high percentage of those that get into the system that the prosecutor has waived. The second effect, and this applies to all mandatory minimums, and I'm sure that this is heard at the legislature quite often. I don't know, we have about 150,000 filings in criminal throughout the state a year. I know just in my jurisdiction alone, just on trial calls, you show up for a trial call and you'll have 4 judges, let's say on trial call in a given week. Every judge has a minimum on their trial calendar, 50 cases for trial that are set for a week. Well, I can't try 50 cases in a week. And there's a lot of pressure on the part of the Supreme Court to clear these cases within timelines to get these cases cleared. So there is a external pressure coming from the system alone to find ways to get cases to clear. And we do not have the capacity. There is not enough resources, be that, and I'm not even speaking to my own agency. There's only about 300 judges in the whole state. You can't try all these cases, and everybody knows that. And I mean, and mandatory minimums apply to guns and all of it. There's a whole line of cases that these apply to. So I'm just, I hear what Brian says about the study, but there's just a whole host of system pressures. And I'm sure the legislature feels like, well, we'll just pass another law. But there isn't any, there aren't any more resources to try these cases. And that's why you're seeing the higher number of departures. I'll just get that out there. That has to be said. With respect to Representative O'Neill's concern that the data from the studies is inaccurate because of the factors that she considers, I guess we could go on to questioning that forever. And basically then assert that any study that's presented is of no use to anyone. And then what we should do is just gear this registration system up. And then everybody that's ever been convicted is going to stay convicted or stay a suspect or stay in the system and can never get out. And it's not until someone that you know or someone that you know whose ox is getting gored that you then begin to understand how this system, how this can work. The rape kits that you have are going to be, you're going to find those people who have prior offended because they gave DNA samples, which is a very effective tool, not because they were on the registry. There isn't any connection between those cases and the registry. And in fact, I haven't heard of one case that the registry has solved.
Brian.
Yeah, I was actually just going to kind of follow up on Representative O'Neill's comment and then Jim's comment beyond that too. Just research, any good research, and folks that the research I'm pulling from here, that folks have been doing it a long time, they always talk about limitations to their study. One of the ones the first sentence under limitations for this one says, given the secretive nature of sexual offending, researchers must always be cognizant of the gap between officially recorded crime and actual behavior. So that's going to be something in every study, just like Jim said. It's unfortunate, but this is, these are the numbers we do have and the actual crimes that we know about, and do the best with the data we have is really, the best we're going to be able to come up with at this point. So just want to throw that in there too.
Senator Ingebretson.
Thank you. So Jim, just a question. When you talk about departure, you're talking about a downward departure, correct? Because of the overload of our system?
Senator, what we were talking about is a classification of cases that are called mandatory minimums, that in order to get off of that sentence requires the prosecutor to waive it. And then you can talk about it being a departure. Okay?
Okay.
So there's a classification of cases where the judges have discretion outside of that aren't covered by a mandatory minimum, where there could be substantial and compelling factors that would justify a departure. And the judges can or do depart. Mandatory minimums require that a prosecutor waive them. And without that waiver, that guy's going to prison.
All right.
Go ahead. Hey, Jim, just give you an example of a case that we at the BCA assisted the Alexandria Police Department. They had 2 rapes out of a gas station in Alexandria, and some of the MOs were the same as. So we took those MOs and went into the registry and found people in Alexandria who had the same type of MOs and developed a suspect from that. Put up surveillance on him and caught him doing another sexual assault there in Alexandria. I don't think that case would have been solved as quickly or even at all if we hadn't had the registry to look for people in that area who had similar crimes in the past. So it does get used, and we do solve cases using it. And that's just one example. I use it all the time. Like I said before, in our internet crimes against children cases, we use the registry a lot, looking for, if it's a suspect that we identify who's on the registry, it gives us information about what vehicles they're driving, where they're working, stuff that we wouldn't know without having that on there. And like I said, a lot of our internet crimes against children suspects who are doing child pornography cases have a previous conviction for that, and that's where we get that information.
Sherry.
I'm just trying to stay on track in terms of what we're trying to solve, and I think all the commentary is very valuable, and I can appreciate both angles that were just presented. But are we really talking about mandatory minimums for both failure to register and incarceration? And you did the poll on incarceration, and I think what you said is 3 out of the 14 said don't touch it. 11 said just make it for predatory offenses. Is the second question failure to register? And how do we feel about that? And then the third is what, Jim, I mean, I get it, but what gets you off-boarded? So let's say we touched neither of those or we amended one slightly. If you're flawless for 10 years or 7 years or 6 years, what off-ramps you? Because then that solves your problem, but a different way. And again, not coming from the background that you all come from, but does good get you better or does bad get you worse, if you will? I mean, if you're going to commit another crime, I still believe it's a restart, but again, I understand not everybody does. If you suggest that failure to register has a mandatory minimum, how do we feel about that? And that's why I think we asked ourselves, how difficult is it to register in the first place? And if we know that this paperwork was simple and that it's at a very high rate, to Sheriff Heck's points, are those serial avoiders who don't want to be registered? How difficult is it to do it? And that's where, I think there's 3 separate questions. And I think, Mark, your survey was helpful. But so what happens now on the fact that 11 out of the 14 said, we think we should look at just predatory offenses? We should look at that restart. How do we all feel about that? And then to Representative O'Neill's point, do we have to, as she stated, should we all be complete consensus, right? We're not going to go to the floor with something that does not have law enforcement and complete alignment across the board. And I think that's where we continue to go round and round. My guess is, I think.
Just a clarification, Sherry, the question included not just registration offenses, but crimes against the person, which is additional things. So, Jim.
I don't have an issue with extensions for people who have committed a predatory offense and commit some other predatory offense or crimes against the person. I don't have a point to argue against that. I think there's a classification of cases that folks get caught up in that aren't in that classification that cause for more of a that extend people out that aren't necessarily going to commit another predatory offense. And I think that's what the discussion was at. Now, with respect to mandatory minimums weren't covered under this to begin with. It was a question that Nate brought up about that. And of course, mandatory minimums are covered in the, mandatory minimums have been are covered in the predatory offender statute. And of course, if you get convicted of a failure to register, you're going to get an extension as well. So, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that we were trying to say, I would think that maybe what I'm saying is that it's practically speaking, that the, whether or not mandatory minimums are in fact working practically. And if you want them to work, you've got to dedicate the resources to get those cases tried. Because for the most part, when you're facing a mandatory minimum, there's no incentive to plead guilty in the system. I mean, there's just no incentive. And I don't think anybody understands that. And those cases are going to go to trial.
Patty.
This is in response to Sherry's comment. Sex offenders have a really hard time finding housing. And so it's not easy to keep your registration current when you have no stable housing. And it's also been shared that some of it is a lower intelligence. They're just not the cleverest people on the block. So I think that the failure to register is punishing people who are already vulnerable instead of us looking at the housing problem and fixing that. I don't know the answer to a lot of this discussion, but I do know that there are people who decide to turn their lives around, and the ones who have stability in all forms of their life are more likely to succeed and not go on to reoffend. And that's the goal. But I think that the continuation of adding on years, it's counterproductive in many ways. But I think that unless we fix the housing issue, that failure to register thing is not going to go away. It's a huge part of it.
Stacy.
So given that we had 11 out of 14 say that the registration requirement extension for reincarceration for a conviction of a crime should be looked at, I just want to kind of get us back to that. We have three people out of the 14 who said no change. And then we have 11 that said we should look at a change. I'm curious to know, I guess I would propose that we start looking at what those changes would be and get in a position to make recommendations for those changes. We may not have, we may not have, 100% buy-in on that, but I think at this point, we're not going to have 100% buy-in on anything that we are doing in this group. That's become pretty clear to me. And, Representative O'Neill has said that unless we, have a consensus on these issues, they're not going to go anywhere. I think then the response to that needs to be, okay, that's fine. We get that from a political standpoint, like nothing's going to get through the legislature if we don't have, like, for example, law enforcement. And what I hear from Sheriff Heck's part, and he's not here, but and I think it's fair to summarize what I'm hearing from him is he would not favor any change that would pull people off or shorten their registration times. So to the extent that we're not going to have law enforcement support there, I think that there's still value to going through if we did have law enforcement support, what would the changes look like? or what are the, aside from law enforcement, what are the proposed modifications that the majority of people are feeling like are worthwhile to propose?
Okay, Patty.
I personally think that if they, that the crime should be related to harming another person. A shoplifting thing shouldn't trigger another registration. Some of the lesser crimes or that are not directly an assault on another person. It's a predatory offender. That's what it's called. So I think that the crime that should trigger it should be something that fits the language that we're using here. And I think that we should be really mindful that not all of the right now, it's not, we're not restricting it to that type of behavior. And I think that's what we need to go back to.
Stacy.
So maybe what the group can do, I'm just trying to think process wise and how do we move things forward. One option would be to look at what currently right now would trigger just the crimes against a person list. I think Brian, someone had recommended that we look at that and say, okay, are these, if all of them are actually against a person, like, you know, truly are against a person, then are there any that would come off that list that we would say, this shouldn't be the basis for a retrigger? And then, you know, just the classes of other crimes, to the extent that there is, you know, not an act of violence against a person, do we go through, you know, a list that way as a group and then, you know, make some recommendations? I'm curious to know what people's appetite for that is. Is that something that happens in the group or is that something that happens outside the group?
Sherry. Whoops.
So I think if we're going to work as a group on something as substantial as that, it should happen inside the group, right? If we're going to look at them and suggest that they're crimes against a person, we're reincarcerated, right? Because that is part of it as well. Then we should look at it and say that we all agree with that. Because for us to come together and put our time and effort against this, you know, unless of course you mean we're willing to meet somewhere else, which I know we've talked about the pluses and minuses of doing that, but to get us together to ask that question. And I know Olivia, I think she sent out the list. I think I'm trying to go through my notes of what those crimes were. Perhaps we could look at those again. And then I think the same question on how we feel on failure to register and what that means specifically. If it's not that difficult, why change it? If it is, you know, to Patty's point, I do agree with you, but I also think, is that really getting at the root cause? You know, I do understand. Is there a better way that we can make failure to register easier for people so that they're known? They're just, yes, it's not easy to find housing. It doesn't mean that you can't, you know, go to the office and you know, I don't know. I feel like they're two separate issues because I agree with you on the housing front. So I think that if we're going to do it, we should do it as a group. And two, how do we feel about the failure to register and that re-trigger?
Sherry, did you want me to send out the statute again to everybody?
Because I think we have to go through the crimes
Okay.
that Stacy's saying again. I found it.
Yeah.
What you sent out, but that would be helpful.
I'll send it out to everybody again.
If people agree that it should be done on this with this group.
Did you want to take a look at those crimes against the person retriggering offenses. I do have sort of a simplified version of that based on the BCA, what's called list 2 offenses.
Mark, I think that more simplified version is actually pretty nice and easy to read.
So I can pull it up here just
Yeah.
so you can take a look at it. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So I just say that Katie can probably
So this isn't ours,
respond to
Mark.
that list.
This isn't ours.
Can we share our list, Mark?
This has to do with community notification.
Yeah, this is more of a simplified version, a little easier to understand, but
Oh, but it's
we can look at
missing-
your list too.
But it's missing some elements.
Yep. Yep. So if you want to show it in a little more detailed, complicated way, are you able to share that, or do you want me to?
I don't know that it's complicated, Mark, but.
We'll pull it up and I'll display in just a minute.
Also, just a side note, we did receive data. This is on failure to register now, flipping back to that. We did receive data from the courts about actual failure to register cases that were charged out and the disposition of those. And those spreadsheets are available. I don't know if this group they were sent out. I missed them when they were first sent, but really helpful. And then I've sent them back to Karen. Basically, I wanted to know if we could resort the data based on race, because I'm wondering, we can't tell here, I guess, from this data whether those failure to registers are, if they were homeless or otherwise disenfranchised or, under-resourced. We can't tell from the data. All we can tell is that there was a failure to register, case, and that they, what the sentencing was. So I'm hoping to get just a snapshot of the race breakdown, because I think that might be interesting to have.
Karen.
So I might have missed something. I think, Mark, wasn't that your data that you sent back out? I'm not sure if that was the spreadsheet that I provided.
Yeah, if you're talking, that is actually from the Sentencing Guidelines Commission. And I don't know if they had
sorry,
worked
Karen.
with-
I
No,
thought it
that's
was you.
but I was curious about that because I responded to you first, but then what Mark forwarded was not my data. So Mark, you can certainly circulate the court data that I've provided to the whole group if that wasn't done or if it needs to get done again. Yeah.
So Mark had sent out failure to register convictions from 2015 to 2019, and these came from the Sentencing Commission, Mark?
Yes.
Okay. I tried to sort based on race, and I'm probably just ill-equipped to deal with these spreadsheets in Excel, but I couldn't get a sort mechanism. So maybe you could just take a look at that. Here we go.
Hi, everyone. So here's the full list of crimes against the person.
And Nate is back. Okay, Nicole.
Yeah, I just had a comment to make about race data. I think it's really helpful. And also, what is hard is if we look at just like the numbers of people, we don't look at the percentage compared to their population size, because then I feel like it doesn't really tell the whole story, right? So if we look at, I think there was 5 Native kids that were on the registry, and I think there was a total of 30 some kids on the registry. So if we look at the population size of Native people in Minnesota, like, I just think it's hard to really get the full picture of the disproportionate numbers when we just look at the raw data. So I don't know how to get to that. I'm not a statistician, so I don't know how to get, make that happen, but I just think it is a challenge, and it doesn't really tell us the whole picture.
Yeah, and that's something we can get those state statistics in comparison with any statistics that are provided. So we see the disparities in there. Yeah. Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. A couple of comments. I'm not sure what race has to do with anything here. I'm not sure what we would do with that information. And second of all, looking at the list that's put out by Nicole, I see nothing on there that could possibly not trigger. These are all pretty serious offenses and would give investigators at least a little idea that this offender could very easily be reoffending or really not. I mean, it's a pretty serious list here. I don't see anything in here that can be taken off, hardly. Can you? Can anybody else give me an idea of that?
Let's see, Sherry. Oops. Kendra, are you able to?
Sorry, yep, sorry. I was just going to agree with the senator. I don't see anything that, and maybe I'm missing something. Is there a broader list that is not to the person that is also included that we've already scrubbed down? Because I see nothing on this list as well that we wouldn't include.
So this is the crimes against the person that folks asked me to display. These crimes are also a part of registration, but this list and the following list are it. That's all.
So today, this list and the following, and the both lists that you showed are what's considered part of a retrigger or extension of the 10 years again. So
no, that's not correct, Sherry.
Okay.
This is Katie talking. So that when Olivia scrolled up, that was our list one. Those are the offenses that require registration. That's 243.166 that came into play back in 1991. This next list that Olivia is scrolling to right now is the list of crimes against the person under Minnesota statute 243.167. People come on under these offenses if they've, 1, completed their registration period and are later on convicted of one of these offenses, they would come back on for 10 years. Or 2, if they had a prior list 1 offense, so like let's pretend a CSC 1, that registration didn't apply to them at the time and they are now convicted of one of these list 2 offenses, they would be subject to registration for 10 years.
Okay, can you?
This is separate from, right now the way it works, any offense resulting in a conviction with either time to serve or time for credits or credit for time served would restart. There is not a limitation on the offenses. Sherry, these are just that, this is just, I think somebody asked us to pull up this list to talk about whether you condense it down to this to only restart registration times for this, I believe.
And Representative O'Neill, I did get to message back and forth with Drew a little bit about some of the sexual assault kits, and folks are seeing patterns in some of them because, you know, naturally they would. We don't yet know if we would classify folks as serial rapists under it, just because there's a significant amount of work yet to be done. But there are patterns being seen.
Yeah.
So Olivia, when you say there are patterns being seen, can you be a little bit more specific?
So we can see when kits share one another. So like if two kits have the same DNA hit, we can see that.
Okay, but so you're not talking about anything on the related to the registry though?
No, I was responding to Representative O'Neill's question earlier about sexual assault kits and patterns within that.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that we're talking about, there's no kind of cross analysis being done at this point about whether those rape kits we're finding people who are already on the registry.
I don't know that I don't believe that was the question, so I can't answer that at this time.
Oh, well, that's my question. Then I'll put that question out. Is there being any cross analysis done between, we've got DNA here and we know that this person is on the registry?
I can look. What we're going to bump into is these are not, all of these sexual assault kits are not complete yet.
No, I know, but I thought that was the point of Representative O'Neill's comment. Maybe I'm missing the point altogether, but I thought the point was we haven't gone through all these rape kits. We don't know if some of these people are already on the registry, that they're repeat offenders. And so we can't understand recidivism data, is what I heard her say, unless we have gone through all the rape kits, at least in Minnesota. We can't really know if the recidivism data is correct until we've gone through all the rape kits and cross-analyzed with current status as registrants.
So I can ask. I don't personally know.
Right,
but what I will say is that our registry is much more inclusive than just those items for which somebody would be charged or found guilty based upon the rape kits.
Brian.
I was just going to get back to kind of my general support for at least starting off in terms of extensions of registration, looking at list 1 and list 2 that we have here. I think it's a good starting point. The list 2 crimes are all violent crimes against a person for the most part, maybe not the felon in possession of a weapon, but as a general list. In addition to that, there has to be as of right now, there has to be a conviction for a list 2 offense. So it limits the same set of circumstances piece. So it'd be somebody convicted of a crime against the person to extend registration, and the list 1 charge, same set of circumstances as it is now, I think is a good discussion point in my view anyways.
Nicole.
Thank you. I just want to respond to the senator's comments about race data and the important, or why race data and why it would be important. I think it's important to really see the disproportionate impact on tribal communities and communities of color, because we are certainly not the only people that commit these offenses, but oftentimes we are the ones who have higher incarceration rates. So it would be helpful to see what the impact is and what the percentages are on the registry.
Nicole, do you know how we would get that? So we can sort these, like this was conviction data from 2015 to 2019, and we can sort them. I'm assuming they can be sorted. I just can't do it based on race. I would imagine that there's some way to figure out what those percentages mean in the bigger picture and not just in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think you would have to look at the population size of the community compare, and then the total number of offenders based on, and then compared to that number. So I feel like it's more complicated than what my brain could process on a Monday morning, but I'm sure there's people that are able to pull this information much easier than me. But yeah, you would have to pull our population size.
Yeah, and Nicole, we can do that. If we have the numbers, we can make a comparison with the most recent demographic breakdowns for the state of Minnesota. Obviously, there's slight difference because some data sets, it's a self-reported status, but it will get us into those general areas. So we can do that breakdown.
Thank you.
Actually fairly easily.
Great, thank you.
So, Patty.
Yeah, I just wanted to validate Nicole's concern. I know that in Minnesota, we only put level 3s on a public registry, but I also know that most people just go and Google sex offenders near me. And there are tons of websites all over the place. And I did that, and there were 29 sex offenders near me. And if they don't know, if it's not a level 3, the offenses, they'll just put unknown, but they're still listed there. And of those 29 within like 3 to 5 miles of me, 12 were Black of the 29. So that's clearly not representative of the St. Cloud area. But I think that her point is really strong, and it needs to be a component that we address at some point. And, you know, the reality is there's a lot of wacko websites out there and a lot of misinformation. But once you are convicted of a sexual offense, you're on public databases all over the place, and it's nearly impossible to get off. So that's probably where I was when I was stating those concerns earlier. It's not because Minnesota only has level 3s. I get that, but the general public is just going to Google sex offenders near me, and they're not going to go to the Department of Corrections and do the proper channels and get the accurate information. Most people.
So I do just want to remind folks of the race data that we were able to provide on registrants as we're talking about this. As of, I want to say it was late August, we had 12,508 white registrants, 3,877 Black registrants, 1,114 American Indian or Alaskan Native, 479 Asian or Pacific Islander, and then 94 unknown. Obviously, these are all self-attestations, so it is totally dependent upon the individual as to how they choose to identify.
So there are those numbers. Okay. Nate.
Thanks, Mark. So I just wanted to offer that the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission does have race data, so we could provide data not on the offender registry, but on the population that's convicted of a felony and sentenced for that felony for violating failure to register. And we do offer comparisons with, you know, the racial profile of Minnesota adults in general, and we do some comparison in that. And we could also look at people sentenced to prison for that as well, and if that's something that's of interest to this group.
Yep. Okay, Sherry.
I think to Patty's point on the searching, I mean, unfortunately, people can search every bit of criminal activity on a person, you know, and so we see it for embezzlement, finance, bankruptcies. I mean, we see people looking all the time. And so I get, again, a bit frustrated. They can find out more about you on Facebook and circulate that out there publicly as well, which is the part that I get challenged. So I continue to come back to Minnesota government sites and say, here's what we're talking about, because I'm with you. And I try to, you know, in the spirit of all of the things that we're looking at, say, what do we own here? Because the aggregating data sites that say they know who sexual predators are is ridiculous. And then they charge you $5.99 to hear more about them, which is a complete, you know, money-making, you know, piracy. So the challenge for me is to suggest we know level 3s are reported and publicly notified. The rest we understand. If we're able to, which I think I continue to go back to your original point on housing and employment. If registering is the expectation when you move, offboarding is part of what we're trying to discuss. And then in the end, we're going to suggest what a restart is triggered by. Those things I feel very like we can stay very grounded on what we're trying to do. But I don't know that we've come up with solutions that help people get employed or find housing. You know, I mean, and the get employed piece seems critical because it's hard to pay for a house if you don't have a job. So I don't know, you know, what else this task force is. I understand this is a requirement section, but I understand. Is there something that would, because we're covering the crimes piece, I mean, or what gets you kind of re-triggered? Are we suggesting that failure to register is, do we have the same question ongoing for that as we do for crimes, for re-triggering? Because have we put that to bed? If we said the minimum statute for failure to register is a 5-year extension, are we, where are we on that one?
Yeah, so we are, as we're approaching the end of our 2-hour period here, we want to make sure that we're looking at the two distinct areas on length of registration. There's both what causes the length of registration to increase, and then a separate issue that we're not talking about today is that off-ramp. That's how to pull back on an already created registration period. Two distinct areas. They don't have to be connected. And then I think, Sherry, you're also talking about what are the consequences of being on the registry. There are those things that aren't, as in things having to do with criminal background checks, but there are certain ones that are both statutorily required and ones that get pulled in. And we haven't covered that today either, those consequences of being on, and only those consequences that could be affected by proposed changes. So, Stacy.
I just want to come back to list 2. Is there anyone that feels strongly that anything up on list 2 should not be a re-triggering conviction, and imprisonment for anything on list 2 should not be a re-triggering, should not re-trigger a 10-year registration?
Do you want me to pull this back up?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay.
Is there anything on that list where people feel like maybe that shouldn't, you know, even though it's on a list 2 crimes against the person, maybe that one, you know, isn't harder to justify, that one being a conviction of that one resulting in another 10 years?
Let me know if this is too difficult for folks to see or if I should zoom in or out.
You could technically scroll down to
Just jump in, Mark,
Yes.
in response to Stacy's question. So, yeah, I mentioned it before. I think the one for me, the unlawful possession of a firearm, it would be the only one that I would be questioning at this point. If somebody's using a firearm in a crime, typically it's going to, we'll get an assault second degree offense and, convicted of that if they're, from what I've seen historically. And the possession one can be a wide variety of circumstances. So I think you might be covering the use of it in a crime and, beating somebody with a weapon, anything like that would be a second degree assault piece. So all the other ones seem to fit person related violent offenses in my mind anyways.
For the most part, I think that unlawful possession is probably a felon in possession is what I take that as. I don't know of any time otherwise that people get charged with unlawful possession of a firearm in those circumstances, unless it would be, if that's the felony level, it's felon in possession is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what I was thinking too, Josh, just that depending on I think that one would be more really looking at the circumstances of it. It's illegal right now, felon to be in a possession of a firearm, but from a retriggering of registration standpoint, if it's somebody that happened to have a gun because he was using it for pheasant hunting as opposed to, a gang member, likely using it in future offenses. That's all I'm saying. There's a little more nuance and difference potentially in the felon in possession one. Some of the other ones you're convicted of, they're going to be a violent crime against a person, even burglary, first degree, breaking into an occupied residence. So I think the rest of them fit in my mind.
Nate.
Thanks, Mark. So just to be clear, this list has been referred to as a retriggering list. My understanding of the use of this list, and Olivia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is a very narrow, like the use of this list is to put somebody on the registry who, although they had committed a registrable offense, they committed it way back before, 2000 or whatnot, and didn't have to register because there was no registry at the time. And then they commit this new offense, get convicted of that, and because they got convicted of this, they have to go on the registry because of that old offense that they had committed. Is that right?
So at the top here, there are two ways that this list applies. And I can resend this to you. I think the group is talking about applying this list in a couple of different ways, but this is how it is currently applied.
Yeah, you're correct in that the part where it's the old list one and then followed by a conviction for one of these, or that they have completed their registration period and then are now convicted of one of these. One of two ways of this statute applying. This is not currently used for anything else other than triggering registration if they're not registered under 243.166 at the time.
Okay.
So the discussion, Nate, on this issue is to borrow this list called List 2 and use it as a retriggering of registration. Instead of having every conviction resulting in incarceration, that it would limit retriggering to just, again, borrowing this list, List 2, and all the List 1 offenses and have them only as retriggering. In fact, List 1 wouldn't be necessary because that would require registration anyway.
Can I please add something to, I know it's been brought up many times that this is like an administrative issue, and that's fine. I understand, we will do what we need to do on the registration end of things. But I think that the group needs to think about also the impact to limiting restarting only based on these. How do we, what is it going to look like for those who have already been restarted for something else? Is this going to be a list that on, make up the date August 1st of 2022 going forward? I think people need to really think about what the effective language would look like on this, and how, the administrative, for lack of better words, the administrative burden. And like I said, we'll do what we need to do with whatever goes through. But I just want people to think about this, that we've got plenty of people that have already been restarted. And now if we limit it to this, think about how you want that to apply.
Sherry.
Mark, can you also just clarify, because again, I want to make sure that I'm clear. If you are currently registered and you're on you're at year 6 on your 10-year, and you commit a first-degree burglary, which is that? You're currently registered, right? So if I at the top, is that? So
if you're currently registered, Sherry, this list has nothing to do with somebody that's currently on the registry with an active registration. This list only applies if they've completed registration or if they never had to register for their list 1. We do not have people register for this. But for example, let's say somebody has a felony domestic assault that they serve time for, irregardless of it being on this list or not, we would restart their registration period if they were given credit for time served or are to serve following that conviction. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, but I'm also asking if you are currently registered and you are working through that 10-year and you commit another crime, what happens to you in that situation?
And so currently, Sherry, if you commit another crime of any kind, doesn't matter what it is, if you serve 1 day incarcerated in jail or prison, you would restart your registration period. So it doesn't matter what the crime is.
So is that what we're discussing, or are we discussing two things?
And Mark, you forgot the key word, conviction.
Yeah.
Not just that you serve time, like 1 day, it doesn't matter. There has to be a conviction connected to the period of incarceration to restart the time.
Right. And so that's what the survey was based on. So if you are currently on the registry, what we are saying here is that anybody who is currently on the registry who commits one of these crimes against a person, not just any crime, one of these crimes, I'm at year 3, I've done 3 years, then I get 10 more added, not 7.
You restart.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's what everybody in the survey agreed to. This list is good for retriggering rather than any conviction.
Well, 11 out of
And
the
no,
14.
not everybody in the survey, only those who responded to the survey.
Yeah.
And only 11 out of 14 agreed that.
Yes.
There were 3 that said all.
Yeah, exactly. Stacy.
Oh, I was just going to respond to Nate's question about why we were looking at this list. And I think we've gotten that out. I hope people understand why we're looking at this list.
Okay. Nate.
Thanks, Stacy. And yeah, I apologize for coming late to the party. But I would agree on to me, I look at that list, unlawful possession of a firearm, and the top and bottom thing on the list, they don't seem to fit. I do think that the violations of the protective orders probably do fit on this list and are probably missing. I would suggest that the DANCO, the OFP, and the HRO violations are crimes against persons, whereas the weapons possessions, I mean, they may be crimes against persons, or they may be part of a crime against a person, but there's plenty of cases of people who are ineligible to possess a firearm, who are possessing a firearm, who are in no way harming anybody, but they shouldn't be having a fire.
I'd like to add too with Nate's comments on maybe one that's missing is that, you know, the restraining order and such. The other one that is surprising that didn't land on this is also terroristic threats. We see a lot of that come through, you know, in violation with somebody that might have that restraining order and such, and the terroristic threats right now isn't doing it.
Sherry.
I guess the only thing, Nate, that I was concerned about when I was preparing for this is I went through and I looked at all of the level 3s listed in Hennepin as an example, just to really become grassroots on it. And the number that completed their offense with the use of a firearm was high, but not high. I mean, I found at least 7 or 8, 9 out of those that had some form of a firearm with them. So that's where my challenge was on that, because one would assume there was a leap there for me that that was a felony in and of itself. And now why do you have, you know, would that be another reason to sort of control?
Okay, let's finish up, Brian, with this. We also want to open it up, make sure that any public members have a chance to say anything. So if there's a public member, please raise your hand as we're approaching this end here.
And I just really quick, I just wanted to kind of second what Katie said. I thought, forgot about that. Terroristic threats is one that I see come through a lot. And I've questioned it in the past as to why that maybe wasn't a part of those 2 offenses. And usually it's associated with other violent charges and the terroristic threats conviction. So it might be a nice one to add to the list.
Okay. Any other things? Anything from the chairs, Stacy or just Stacy, I guess, is left.
Just I'm the last one standing from the
Yes.
chairs. I think the data that Nicole sent over was helpful. If we could just maybe grab that. Do the chats get saved? Can you download the chats?
Yes, we can.
And Nate said that he could pull that data, just maybe confirm it's for those convictions for failure to register. That would be helpful to see the raw numbers against statewide demographics.
Yep, we can do that.
And then I guess, you know, I think we made some good progress in looking at list 2 and thinking through, you know, what could possibly trigger a re-registration for 10 years, and that we just, you know, table this and think about it until our next meeting.
Okay. Then any final words, Olivia?
Nope, I will try to get us the data that was requested by Stacy to see if we have any data on overlap. We don't typically pull reasons for searches, so I'm not 100% sure what we would have in that scenario, but I can look.
You mean overlap for the rape kits?
Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, so I can see what I can pull. Yeah.
And then do we have, how is the master spread, the master data request tracker? How is that coming along?
But if I'm completely honest with you, I have a significant amount of work for this work group and others. And so I am trying to balance the needs of multiple streams here.
Okay. That should do it. We'll wrap this up and be back in 2 weeks, I guess. But next week will be the whole group meeting on Wednesday. And then we have a couple other subgroups today. So thank you all.
Thank you.